The alarm on my wrist unit stopped working 4 seconds before the shooting would have started, and that is the only reason I am alive to tell you this story. My name is Vel Ashtu. I am a scout diplomat of the Cryan Assembly, and on the day I am about to describe, I was standing inside a broken trading platform above a dead moon, surrounded by people who wanted to hurt each other, and I did not notice a human standing 14 meters to my left for 8 full minutes. Let me start where the fear started. The platform was called Corville Station, a rusted ring of metal that used to move fuel between 3 systems before the war economy collapsed and left it empty. My delegation had come to inspect a cargo hold that a human salvage crew claimed as their legal find. My superiors did not trust the humans. The humans did not trust us. Both sides had good reasons, and both sides had weapons drawn low, held at the hip, not raised, but not put away either. I remember the sound of the station groaning around us, metal cooling and expanding in the dark. I remember counting 6 humans and 4 Cryans in the room, plus myself, making 5. I remember the smell of old oil and recycled air that never gets fully clean on stations this size. What I do not remember, what I could not remember no matter how hard I tried afterward, was a 7th human standing near the far wall. I want you to understand something about my species before I go further, because it matters for everything that comes after. Cryans do not see the way humans see. We read heat, we read motion. We read the small vibrations a body makes when it breathes, when it shifts its weight, when its heart beats faster because it is afraid, or excited, or ready to act. This is not a talent, it is baseline biology, built into us the way your eyes are built into you. A Cryan child learns to track 12 moving objects in a room before it learns to speak in full sentences. We do not get surprised by people. We are not supposed to get surprised by people. So when the whisper came through my earpiece, quiet, almost embarrassed, saying that a human had been standing against the far wall for 8 minutes without moving, I did not believe it. I actually laughed, a short involuntary sound that made 2 of my own team turn toward me with confusion in their eyes. Then I turned my head, and I saw him. He was tall, with sandy-colored hair pushed back from his face, wearing a salvage crew jacket with a torn shoulder seam. His name, I would learn later, was Daniel Hart. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, his weight even on both feet, his eyes open and calm, watching the room the way a person watches weather they are not afraid of. 14 meters away. I know the exact distance because I checked it 3 times with my own sensor array after the fact, certain there had been some error, some malfunction in my equipment. There was no malfunction. 14 meters, in plain sight, under normal light, for 8 minutes, and not one member of my delegation had registered him as a threat, as a presence, as anything at all. I felt something in my chest that I did not have a word for yet. It was not exactly fear. It was closer to the feeling of stepping onto a stair that is not there, that sudden drop when the ground fails to meet your foot the way it should. The tension in the room had not eased. If anything, it had grown sharper, because the human crew leader, a woman named Grace Whitfield, had just told my superior that the cargo belonged to her people under station recovery law, and my superior had responded that Cryan Assembly claims predated any human presence in this sector by 11 years. Words were getting louder. Hands were drifting closer to weapons that had not yet been raised but were no longer entirely lowered either. And through all of it, Daniel Hart did not move. I want to be clear that stillness itself is not unusual. Rocks are still. Machines that are switched off are still. What made this different, what made my instruments fail to flag him the way they should have, was that his stillness had the texture of readiness rather than absence. I did not understand this distinction yet. I only understood, in that moment, that something about the room had been wrong for 8 full minutes, and none of us had known it. I signaled to my second, a sharp-eyed scout named Orrin Cade, using the small hand movements we use when we do not want to alert a room to a change in awareness. Orrin followed my gaze and went rigid. I watched the vibration in his breathing spike, the telltale sign of alarm that Cryan bodies cannot hide from each other, even when we try. Grace Whitfield noticed our reaction before her own people did. She was quick. sharper than the briefing files had led me to expect. She followed our eyes to Daniel, and something crossed her face that was not surprise. It looked almost like a private thought completing itself, like watching someone finish a sentence they had been composing for a while. She said his name once, quietly. Daniel. He answered without turning his head fully, without any hurry in his voice at all. He said he was still watching the door. Those 5 words did more to unsettle me than any weapon in the room. The door. He had been tracking the door, the only entrance and exit to this section of the station, for 8 minutes, while everyone else, including me, had been tracking each other. My superior, a senior diplomat named Kel Vantrick, demanded to know why a member of the salvage crew had been positioned without announcement. Grace answered that Daniel had not been positioned by her. He had simply walked there himself, early, before the meeting began, and had chosen to stay. I remember thinking that this answer made no sense. In my experience, and in the experience of every briefing document I had ever studied on human behavior, humans moved when they were nervous. They paced. They spoke to fill silence. They needed motion the way some engines need fuel, constant small consumption just to keep from stalling. This is what we were taught. This is what every Cryan scout before me had reported for over 100 years of contact. Daniel Hart had done none of that. He had stood in one place, in open view, and simply waited, watching an exit that the rest of us had stopped watching the moment the argument began. The room went quiet in a strange way, the kind of quiet that is louder than shouting because everyone in it suddenly understands that something important has shifted and nobody knows exactly what. Kel Vantrick asked the question that I think all of us wanted answered. He asked what Daniel had been waiting for. Daniel finally turned his head, slow, unhurried, and looked directly at me instead of at Kel. I do not know why he chose me. Perhaps because I was the one who had noticed him first, even if it had taken 8 minutes to do it. He said that he had been waiting to see if this was going to be the kind of disagreement that needed a calm voice, or the kind that needed a fast hand. He said it so plainly, so without any weight of performance, that for a moment none of us responded at all. I felt my own vitals spike, the tightening in my chest that comes before real fear, the kind our training tells us to notice and control. I had spent my entire career studying humans as a species defined by impulse, by heat, by decisions made too quickly and regretted too late. That was the foundation of every strategy my assembly had built for dealing with them. And here was a human who had spent 8 minutes doing the opposite of everything I had been taught to expect, standing 14 meters away, patient as stone, watching a door the rest of us had forgotten existed. The argument in the room had not ended. Voices were still raised. Kel Vantrick and Grace Whitfield were still locked in a disagreement about cargo rights that neither side seemed ready to lower their voice about. But something had changed in the air, a kind of held breath that had not been there a minute before. I looked at Daniel again. He had already turned his attention back to the door, patient, unbothered by the fact that an entire room had just discovered him. I did not know yet what he was waiting for. I did not know that the next 4 minutes would decide far more than the ownership of a cargo hold. I only knew that my instruments, my training, and every report ever filed by a Cryan scout about human nature had just failed in the same 8 minutes, and I had a very uncomfortable feeling that this failure was going to matter far beyond this one rusted station. I remember reaching for my recorder, my hands unsteady in a way they had not been in years, and beginning to log everything I could, because some instinct in me, some quiet and correct instinct, understood that I was standing inside the beginning of something the whole galaxy would eventually have to reckon with. I just did not yet understand how large that something was going to be. The room held its breath. Daniel Hart kept watching the door, and I kept watching him, finally, 14 meters away, wondering how many others like him I had walked past without ever knowing they were there at all. To understand why this moment shook me so deeply, you need to know what I had been taught to believe about humans since the day I entered the Assembly Academy on my home world. Our first contact with humans happened almost 140 years before I was born, and the reports from that era shaped every lesson that followed. The earliest Cryan scouts described a species that moved too fast, spoke too loudly, and made decisions with their emotions instead of their reason. They described humans as creatures who filled silence the way water fills a cracked vessel, constantly, without pause, as if stillness itself caused them physical discomfort. I remember sitting in a cold lecture hall as a young student, watching recordings of early human diplomats pacing across meeting rooms, tapping their fingers against tables, speaking over each other in overlapping bursts of urgency. Our instructors used these recordings as proof of a simple rule that every Cryan scout carried into the field. Humans act before they think. Humans cannot hold silence. Humans reveal themselves through motion because motion is what they are built for. This rule was not just classroom theory. It shaped treaties. It shaped border agreements. It shaped the way entire fleets were positioned along contested trade lanes. Because Cryan strategists believed that if a conflict with humans ever began, it would begin loud, fast, and easy to predict. We built our entire defensive doctrine around the idea that humans could not wait. I had built my own career around that same idea. In 11 years of fieldwork, I had negotiated with human traders, human settlers, human military attachés, and every single encounter had reinforced what the Academy taught me. Humans spoke quickly. Humans fidgeted. Humans needed to fill the space around them with words or movement, and if you watched closely enough, you could always see the moment before they acted, because their bodies told you first. That is why Daniel Hart's stillness felt less like a surprise and more like an injury. I turned my recorder toward him without asking permission, a small breach of formal etiquette that I would later have to explain to my superiors, but in that moment I did not care. I needed to understand what I was looking at. His pulse, when I finally isolated it from the noise of the room, was steady, not artificially slow, not medicated, not suppressed by any technology I could detect. Just steady, the way a resting animal's pulse is steady. An animal that is not afraid because it has already decided what it will do if there is a reason to be afraid. I thought of every human diplomat I had ever sat across from, tapping pens, shifting weight, filling silence with soft, nervous laughter. None of them had prepared me for a man who could stand in the middle of an armed disagreement and simply exist without disturbing the air around him. Grace Whitfield noticed my attention shifting fully onto Daniel, and something in her posture eased slightly, as though she had been waiting for one of us to finally see what she had already understood. She said that Daniel used to serve on rescue teams before he joined her crew, the kind of teams that pulled survivors out of collapsed mining shafts and burning transport wrecks. She said that, in that line of work, a person who could not stay calm got other people killed. She said it simply, without pride, the way someone states a fact about the weather. Kel Vantrick, my superior, absorbed this information with visible difficulty. I could see the muscles along his jaw tighten, the same way mine likely had. It is a strange thing to watch an old belief crumble in real time, especially one that has quietly supported every decision you have ever made about an entire species. The argument over the cargo hold had not disappeared. If anything, it simmered now beneath the surface of this new discovery, both sides distracted from their original disagreement by something far stranger unfolding in front of them. Weapons were still present, still not raised, but the temperature of the room had shifted from confrontation to something closer to uneasy curiosity. I asked Daniel directly, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, why he had chosen to stay silent about his position, rather than announce himself when the meeting began. He answered that announcing himself would have changed how everyone else behaved. He said that if people know they are being watched by someone specific, they perform differently than if they believe no one significant is paying attention. He wanted to see how the room would move on its own, without adjusting itself around his presence. This answer unsettled me more than anything that had come before it, because it meant his stillness had not been passive. It had been a deliberate tool, a method of observation built from patience rather than technology. I thought of every Cryan sensor sweep, every scan, every piece of equipment my species had built over centuries to track motion, heat, and vibration. All of it existed to give us an advantage that came naturally to us as a species. And here was a human achieving something similar, not through biology or machinery, but through discipline alone, a discipline so complete that it had made him invisible to instruments built specifically to notice presence. Kel Vantrick asked Grace how many members of her crew were capable of the same kind of stillness. I watched her consider the question honestly, rather than answering quickly to score some advantage in the ongoing dispute. She said not all of them, but more than we would expect. She said that humanity had learned, across generations of difficult work in mines, in emergency response, in long isolated postings on frontier stations, that patience saved more lives than speed ever did. She said that the old stories about humans acting on impulse were not entirely wrong, but they were incomplete, because they only described humans who had never needed to learn otherwise. I found myself recording her words as carefully as I had recorded Daniel's stillness, because I understood, even then, that this conversation was rewriting something fundamental. The disagreement over the cargo hold, which had brought both delegations to this station in the first place, suddenly felt smaller than it had an hour earlier. Ownership of scrap metal and old fuel lines mattered far less than the discovery that an entire species assumption, built over a century of contact, might be built on incomplete observation. I looked again at Daniel, still positioned near the wall, still watching the door with the same unhurried attention he had shown from the very beginning. I asked him what exactly he had been watching for, since the meeting had proceeded without incident for the first several minutes before tension started rising. He said he had noticed something the rest of us had missed. He said that just before the meeting began, a maintenance drone near the entrance had shifted its patrol pattern slightly, deviating from its normal route by a small but measurable degree. He had wanted to know why. None of my own scans had picked up this deviation. None of Oren Cade's instruments had flagged it either. Yet Daniel had noticed it with nothing more than patient human attention, and had positioned himself accordingly, choosing a spot where he could watch both the door and the drone's patrol path at the same time. A cold understanding settled into my chest. If the drone's pattern shift meant what I feared it might mean, then someone outside our two delegations had been monitoring this meeting, and whoever it was had been doing so long before either side had noticed a single sign of it. I asked Daniel directly whether he believed the drone posed a threat. For the first time since I had noticed him, his expression changed slightly, a narrowing of focus that made the room feel colder. He said he did not know yet. He said that was exactly why he had been standing still for 8 minutes, waiting for one more piece of information before deciding whether the danger was real. Grace Whitfield's crew shifted almost imperceptibly at this statement, a collective tightening that told me they trusted Daniel's judgment completely, even without fully understanding what he had seen. My own delegation, meanwhile, stood frozen in a different kind of uncertainty, caught between old assumptions that no longer felt reliable and a new reality none of us had prepared for. Kel Vantrick asked what we should do. It was, I think, the first time in my career that I had heard a senior Cryan diplomat ask a human for guidance rather than the reverse. Daniel did not answer immediately. He simply continued watching the door, patient as ever, and for a long moment the entire room, both delegations, weapons still lowered but no longer forgotten, waited together in a silence that felt entirely different from the tense quiet we had started with. It was in that silence I would later realize that the true event of that day actually began, not with words, not with weapons, but with everyone in that room finally understanding that the old rules we had built our expectations around no longer applied, and none of us yet knew what would replace them. I want to walk you through what happened next exactly as the station's own logs later confirmed it, because at the time I understood only pieces of it, and it took days of review afterward for the full picture to become clear. The maintenance drone that Daniel had noticed belonged, officially, to the station itself, a small automated unit meant to patrol corridors and report structural wear. According to its registered programming, it should never have altered its patrol route without a direct command from station authority. Corville Station had no active authority anymore. It had been abandoned by its original operators years earlier, which was the entire reason both delegations believed the cargo hold was available to claim in the first place. A drone with no living operator does not deviate from its pattern by accident. This was the quiet, cold fact sitting underneath Daniel's 8 minutes of silence, and it was the fact none of the rest of us, Cryan or human, had considered until he raised it. Grace Whitfield asked her own technician, a young man named Peter Lang, to pull up the drone's control signal remotely from a handheld unit he carried on his belt. It took him less than a minute to confirm something that made the temperature of the room drop even further. The drone was receiving updated patrol instructions from a source outside the station, a signal too weak and too well hidden to be picked up by standard scans, the kind of signal built specifically to avoid detection. Someone was watching this meeting from somewhere else on the station, and they had been watching it since before either delegation arrived. I felt the old fear return, sharper this time, because now it had a direction. My training told me to expect chaos from the humans in the room, shouting, sudden movement, a scramble toward the exit. Instead, I watched Grace Whitfield's crew go quiet and focused, each of them shifting slightly to cover different sections of the room without any spoken instruction, as though they had rehearsed this exact kind of moment long before it ever happened. Daniel finally moved. It was not sudden. It was not dramatic. He simply walked, at an even pace, toward the corridor junction near the door he had been watching the entire time, and as he walked, he spoke without raising his voice at all. He said that whoever was controlling the drone had likely placed a relay device somewhere close enough to maintain a stable signal, since the type of interference pattern Peter Lang had detected did not travel well across long distances inside a station built from this much old metal. He said the relay was probably hidden within reach of the corridor junction, based on the drone's patrol geometry. I remember thinking, even in that tense moment, that his reasoning was remarkably clear for someone I had once believed incapable of calm thought under pressure. Kel Vantrick asked whether we should retreat rather than approach an unknown threat directly. It was again a question aimed at Daniel rather than at anyone within our own delegation, a small but significant shift in how quickly trust had realigned itself in that room. Daniel answered that retreating blindly down a corridor we had not yet secured could put us directly into a position the hidden observer wanted us in. He said that standing still without acting was often safer than moving without information, which was, I realized, the exact same principle that had kept him silent and unnoticed for 8 minutes at the very beginning of the meeting. It was in this moment that I finally understood what I had been failing to see. Daniel Hart's stillness was never emptiness. It was a form of control, a discipline built from experience, the same discipline that now guided him to move carefully rather than quickly, to gather information rather than react to fear. He reached the corridor junction and knelt beside an old maintenance panel set into the wall, one that any of us might have walked past 100 times without a second look. He worked at it with steady hands, unhurried despite the tension radiating from everyone behind him, and after a short while he lifted free a small device no larger than his palm, dull gray, humming faintly with a low electrical charge. He held it up for the room to see. He said this was the relay, confirming what he had suspected, and that whoever placed it here had done so recently, since the dust pattern around the panel showed clear disturbance. Grace Whitfield asked whether the device was dangerous in itself. Daniel said no, it was only a signal booster, not a weapon, but its presence meant someone had gone to considerable effort to observe this meeting without being detected, and that fact alone was worth taking seriously. Kel Vantrick, to his credit, asked the next necessary question. He asked who among the known parties in this sector might benefit from watching a disagreement over abandoned cargo between a human crew and a Cryan delegation. It was Oren Cade, my own second, who offered an answer none of us wanted to hear. He suggested that a third party, likely one of the smaller trade factions competing with both our peoples for control of this exact shipping route, may have wanted to see whether tensions between humans and Cryans could be escalated into open conflict without either side realizing they were being manipulated toward it. The room absorbed this possibility in heavy silence. I thought back to the argument that had consumed the first several minutes of our meeting, voices rising, hands drifting toward weapons, both delegations convinced the other posed the greater threat. If Oren was right, that escalation had been exactly what someone outside this room wanted to happen. Daniel's stillness, his refusal to be pulled into the noise of the argument, had prevented that outcome from unfolding the way it may have been designed to. I asked him directly whether he had suspected manipulation from the very beginning, before the drone's pattern shift confirmed it. He said he had not been certain, but he had learned, through long experience, that the moments when two sides seem most ready to turn against each other are often exactly the moments someone else benefits most from watching closely. Grace Whitfield placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, a small gesture of shared understanding that told me this was not the first time his patience had prevented a situation from turning into something far worse. Kel Vantrick, after a long pause, did something I had never once seen a senior Cryan diplomat do in 11 years of service. He extended a formal apology, not for any specific action, but for the assumptions his delegation had carried into the meeting, assumptions that had nearly led us toward the very outcome the hidden observer had hoped for. Grace accepted the apology simply, without ceremony, and suggested that both delegations focus first on securing the corridor and reporting the relay device to whatever authority still held jurisdiction over this sector, before returning to the matter of the cargo hold itself. It was a practical suggestion, calm and clear, and I noticed that Daniel nodded slightly at her words, the same quiet approval a person gives when they see a plan handled well by someone they trust. Over the next several minutes, both crews worked together in a way I would not have predicted possible at the start of the meeting. Cryan scanners, Peter Lang's handheld analysis tools, and Daniel's own careful observation combined to trace the relay's signal history, confirming Oren's suspicion that a third faction operating just beyond the edge of the system had indeed been listening in, hoping to record evidence of conflict they could use to justify further interference in the region. By the time the corridor was declared secure and the relay device fully disabled, the earlier argument over the cargo hold felt almost irrelevant. Grace offered to split any usable salvage from the hold between both crews as a gesture of goodwill, an offer Kel Vantrick accepted without the hesitation I would have expected from him only an hour before. I stood near the wall where Daniel had once stood unnoticed, watching both delegations move together with a kind of careful cooperation that no briefing document in my assembly's archives had ever predicted was possible. I thought about the 8 minutes that had started all of this, minutes in which a single human had stood still, watched patiently, and quietly prevented a conflict that could have echoed far beyond this one abandoned station. I understood, standing there, that I was not simply witnessing the resolution of one dispute. I was witnessing the first crack in a belief that had shaped Cryan policy toward humanity for over a century, and I did not yet know how far that crack would spread once word of what happened here reached beyond this small, forgotten corner of space. 3 days after Corvell Station, I sat alone in a small quarters aboard our return vessel, staring at a blank report screen, unable to write a single sentence. This had never happened to me before. In 11 years of fieldwork, I had filed hundreds of reports, some describing tense negotiations, some describing minor incidents, a few describing genuine danger. I had always known how to frame those events within the language my assembly expected, careful and measured, fitting neatly into categories that senior officials could quickly file and act upon. I did not know how to categorize what had happened on Corvell Station. If I wrote that a human had prevented a manufactured conflict through patience and careful reasoning, I worried my superiors would assume I had exaggerated the account out of some strange sympathy for the species I was meant to observe objectively. If I underplayed what happened, reducing it to a simple, resolved misunderstanding over cargo rights, I would be hiding the single most important detail of the entire encounter, the detail that mattered more than any relay device or hidden faction. The detail that an entire room of trained Cryan observers, myself included, had failed to notice a person standing in plain sight for 8 full minutes. I finally began writing not with an explanation, but with the numbers themselves. 14 meters, 8 minutes, 0 vital spikes recorded by 4 separate cryon sensor arrays. I let the report open with facts rather than interpretation, because I did not trust myself yet to interpret what those facts meant. Kel Vantrick reviewed my draft before it was sent further up the assembly chain. I remember the silence that stretched between us as he read it, his eyes moving slowly across each line, his expression unreadable in the way senior diplomats train themselves to maintain. When he finally spoke, he asked me a single question. He asked whether I believed this was an isolated case, one unusually disciplined individual among a species otherwise unchanged from what our records described, or whether I believed it represented something broader. I told him honestly that I did not know, but that the uncertainty itself frightened me more than a clear answer in either direction would have. He nodded slowly and told me to submit the report exactly as written, without softening it, without smoothing its edges into something more comfortable for the officials who would read it. He said that if the assembly had built a century of strategy on an incomplete picture of humanity, the discomfort of admitting that was a smaller cost than the danger of continuing to act on false assumptions. I submitted the report that evening. Within a week, something began happening that I had not expected. Other Cryon scouts across different sectors began requesting access to my report, and in turn, several of them began quietly reviewing their own old surveillance recordings of human encounters, searching for patterns they had previously dismissed as unremarkable. A scout stationed near a human agricultural colony reported finding recordings of workers standing motionless during equipment failures, waiting calmly for exact moments to intervene rather than panicking at the first sign of malfunction. Another scout, assigned to monitor a human deep space relay station, found footage of an engineer remaining still and silent through a prolonged pressure emergency, conserving oxygen and directing others with a calm voice instead of the frantic energy our doctrine expected. None of these had been flagged as significant at the time they were recorded. Each incident had simply been filed away, unremarkable, because no one had been looking for the pattern Daniel Hart had revealed to me on Corvell Station. I began corresponding with these scouts directly, comparing notes, building a slowly growing collection of moments that all pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. Humanity's reputation for impulsiveness, the very foundation of Cryon strategic doctrine, had been built from observing humans in situations that demanded quick reaction, and had almost entirely ignored situations that demanded patience instead. We had studied humans at their loudest, and mistaken that for the whole of what they were. I want to be honest about how difficult this realization was for me personally, because I do not think the story is complete without it. For 11 years, I had built my professional identity around being an observer, someone whose entire value came from noticing things others missed. I had prided myself on reading a room, tracking motion, understanding intention before it became action. Discovering that I had walked past exactly this kind of discipline for over a decade without ever recognizing it forced me to question far more than just assembly doctrine. It forced me to question my own competence, my own eyes, the very skill that had defined my entire career. I remember speaking with Orrin Cade about this during the long transit back toward assembly space. He admitted that he felt the same unsettled doubt, the same quiet fear that our profession had been built on a blind spot none of us had known to look for. We began to wonder together how many other moments, across 100 years of contact, had been misread in the same way. How many human diplomats we had once dismissed as simply calm rather than controlled. How many human crews we had assumed were unprepared rather than deliberately patient. The more we discussed it, the larger the gap in our understanding seemed to grow. Word of what happened on Corvell Station eventually reached beyond scouting circles and into political ones, which is where the true weight of the moment began to settle. Several smaller factions that had long relied on Cryon assumptions about human unpredictability began quietly reassessing their own strategies. Trade negotiations that had once assumed humans would concede quickly under pressure, expecting them to act before thinking clearly, started moving more cautiously as negotiators realized they might be facing a species capable of far more patience than previously believed. I learned later that the very faction responsible for the hidden relay device on Corvell Station had intended to use manufactured tension between humans and Cryans as evidence to justify expanding their own influence in contested trade routes, painting both species as unstable and in need of external oversight. Daniel's stillness, his refusal to be pulled into panic, had denied them the very evidence they needed. This detail, once confirmed, spread quickly among assembly officials, and I watched, almost in real time, as an old and comfortable assumption about an entire species began to erode under the weight of a single documented incident. Kel Vantrick was summoned to provide testimony before a regional council reviewing assembly policy toward human territories. I was asked to accompany him, since my report had become the primary source document for the entire proceeding. I remember standing in a formal chamber I had only ever seen in training simulations, surrounded by senior officials whose decisions shaped policy across dozens of systems, and being asked directly whether I believed our existing doctrine toward humanity required revision. I answered honestly, though my voice was not as steady as I would have liked. I said that I had spent 11 years believing I understood a species that I had, in fact, only ever observed at its most reactive, and that the discovery of Daniel Hart's patience had shown me a dimension of human behavior our doctrine had never accounted for. I said that if a single scout, trained specifically to notice presence and motion, could stand 14 meters from a person for 8 minutes without registering their existence, then our entire framework for predicting human behavior in moments of true crisis needed to be questioned, not dismissed, but questioned honestly and thoroughly. The chamber remained quiet for a long moment after I finished speaking. I do not know exactly what conclusions were reached in the discussions that followed, since much of the deeper policy debate happened beyond my clearance level. What I do know is that within 2 months, new training materials began circulating among Cryan scouts, materials that included, for the first time, detailed analysis of human patience, discipline, and calculated stillness, alongside the older lessons about impulsiveness and speed. My report, along with the growing collection of similar incidents gathered from other scouts, became a foundational document in that new training material. I did not expect this outcome when I first sat frozen in front of a blank report screen, unable to find the words to describe what I had witnessed. I returned briefly to Corvell Station several weeks later, officially to finalize documentation related to the relay device investigation, though I admit, part of my reason for returning was personal. I wanted to see the space again, to stand where I had once stood, surrounded by tension I had completely misjudged. I did not expect to find Daniel Hart still working nearby, assisting with the final salvage arrangements between his crew and assembly representatives. When I approached him, I found myself unsure of exactly what I wanted to say, a rare feeling for someone whose profession depended on always knowing the right words for a given situation. I finally asked him a simple question. I asked whether he had known, in those 8 minutes, that he was quietly proving an entire species wrong about his own. He considered the question for a moment before answering. He said he had not been thinking about proving anything. He said he had simply been doing what experience had taught him to do, watching carefully, waiting for the right information before acting, the same discipline he would have used regardless of who was in the room or what they believed about him beforehand. It was, I realized, the most honest answer he could have given, and somehow that honesty mattered more to me than any grand statement about changing galactic perception ever could have. I thanked him, formally at first, then less formally, in a way that surprised me given how carefully I usually guarded my own emotional expression during official duties. I told him that his stillness had changed more than one meeting's outcome. I told him it had changed how an entire species now understood his own. He accepted this with the same calm he had shown from the very beginning, neither proud nor dismissive, simply present, the way he always seemed to be. I left Corvell Station that day with a very different understanding of what my profession truly required of me. I had spent 11 years believing that observation meant noticing motion, heat, and vibration, the things my biology made effortless for me to detect. I understood now that true observation required noticing the absence of those things as well, understanding that stillness itself could carry meaning far greater than anything loud or immediate ever could. I did not yet know how far this lesson would travel beyond my own small career, or how many other species across the galaxy would eventually have to relearn what they believed they understood about humanity. I only knew that the 8 minutes I had once failed to notice had become the most important 8 minutes of my professional life, and that the galaxy, slowly and quietly, was beginning to notice them too. 2 years passed before I fully understood the size of what began on that abandoned station. I had returned to a quieter posting by then, training newer scouts at a Cryon Academy on the Outer Rim, a position I had once considered a step away from meaningful work. I discovered instead that it placed me at the very center of something far larger than I expected. The incident on Corvell Station had, by that time, become a named case study across multiple academies, referred to informally among instructors as the 14-meter account. I remember the first time I heard a young student use that phrase in a classroom that was not my own, unaware that the scout who had lived through it was standing only a few seats away, quietly listening. The lesson taught alongside it was simple in wording, but difficult in practice. Do not mistake stillness for absence. Do not assume a species you have only observed under pressure is the whole of what that species can be. The instructors who built this lesson had drawn from my original report, along with dozens of similar incidents gathered from scouts across many different sectors, each one describing a moment where human patience had gone unnoticed until it mattered most. I was eventually asked to teach this lesson myself, a request I accepted with a mixture of pride and lingering discomfort, since teaching it required me to describe, again and again, the exact moment I had failed as an observer before I understood why that failure mattered. I told my students the same things I am telling you now. I told them about the room, the tension, the drone whose patrol pattern had shifted just slightly enough to matter. I told them about a man named Daniel Hart, standing 14 meters away, patient as stone, watching a door the rest of us had forgotten to watch ourselves. I watched over time as this single lesson began reshaping something larger than classroom doctrine. Diplomatic postings that had once been staffed, based on assumptions about how quickly the other side might act under pressure, began factoring patience into their planning instead. Negotiators who had once tried to rush human counterparts into quick decisions, believing speed favored their side, began adjusting their expectations, understanding that a calm human across the table might simply be waiting, gathering information, rather than struggling to keep pace with the conversation. I heard, secondhand through colleagues in other sectors, that other species entirely, not just Cryons, had begun quietly revising their own assumptions after word of the 14-meter account spread through shared diplomatic channels. A species known for extremely fast reflexes and short attention spans of their own had apparently begun reviewing decades of old human interaction footage, searching for the same overlooked pattern of deliberate stillness and finding it far more often than they expected. It became, in a strange way, a shared galactic reckoning, not about human strength or human technology, both of which had always been well documented and carefully measured by every species in contact with them, but about something far harder to quantify: human patience, human discipline, the ability to remain calm not because nothing was happening, but because everything was being watched carefully before a single decisive action was taken. I want to return, briefly, to my own personal experience during this period, because I think it matters for understanding how deeply this single event reshaped not just policy, but the people who lived through it. I began practicing stillness myself, deliberately, during quiet hours at the academy. I would stand in an empty training hall and try to hold myself the way Daniel had held himself on Corvell Station, weight even, hands loose, attention focused outward rather than inward on my own discomfort. I discovered quickly how difficult this truly was. My Cryon instincts pulled constantly toward motion, toward small adjustments, toward the need to confirm through movement that I was alert and ready. It took months of quiet, private practice, before I could hold real stillness for even 2 full minutes without my body betraying some small sign of restlessness. Daniel had held his for 8, in the middle of active tension, without a single flicker my instruments could detect. I do not say this to suggest that stillness alone was the secret to what he accomplished. I understood by then that the discipline behind it, the years of experience that taught him when to remain still and when to move, mattered just as much as the stillness itself. It was not simply an absence of motion. It was motion held in reserve, ready and controlled, released only at the exact moment it was needed. I eventually reached out to Daniel again, several years after our first meeting, curious whether he understood the scale of what his 8 minutes had set into motion across Cryon academies and beyond. I found him still working alongside Grace Whitfield's crew, though their operations had expanded considerably since our first encounter, now handling salvage and security contracts across a wider stretch of contested territory. I asked him whether it felt strange to know that a moment he had treated as ordinary, simply doing what experience had taught him, had become a formal lesson taught to scouts and diplomats across multiple worlds. He considered the question for a while before answering, the same careful pause I remembered from our very first conversation. He said that it felt less strange than I might expect, because from his perspective, nothing about that day had actually changed. He had done what he always did in uncertain situations, watched carefully, waited for the right information, and acted only when acting mattered. The only thing that had changed, he said, was that someone had finally noticed. I told him that this was, in many ways, exactly the point. Not that humanity had suddenly discovered a new kind of discipline, but that the rest of the galaxy had simply been looking in the wrong direction for over a century, mistaking quiet confidence for absence, mistaking patience for weakness, mistaking calm readiness for nothing happening at all. I think often about the moment I first turned my head and saw him standing there, 14 meters away, calm in the middle of a room that believed itself alone with its own tension. I think about how close we came, that day, to a conflict engineered entirely by outside manipulation, a conflict that would have unfolded exactly the way an old faction hoped, loud, fast, and easily justified as further proof that both our species were too unstable to be trusted with the trade routes we both depended on. None of that happened, not because of any weapon, not because of any advanced technology, but because one man understood that the most important moments in a crisis are often the quiet ones, before anyone else realizes a crisis has even begun. I no longer serve as a field scout. I teach now, full-time, sharing this account with new generations of Cryon diplomats who will go on to meet humans in situations we cannot yet predict. I tell them always to remember the lesson at the center of everything that happened on Corvell Station, a lesson far simpler than any strategic doctrine we once relied upon. Do not assume silence means nothing is there. Do not assume stillness means weakness. The species you believe you understand may simply be choosing, in that exact moment, not to move yet, watching carefully, waiting for the one piece of information that will tell them exactly when and how to act. I stood 14 meters beside a man for 8 minutes and saw nothing at all. It remains, to this day, the most important failure of my entire career, because it taught me, and eventually taught an entire galaxy, that the quietest presence in the room is very often the one most worth watching.